For 27 years, the Corvin family carried a secret so dark that just about everyone who heard the sick rumors refused to believe them. Many around Boynton Beach, Florida had heard the stories from Sarah Morgan herself, the teenage girl who would tell her outrageous tale to anyone who would listen. Some said they believed her. Most thought she was full of it. They were probably convinced that the girl had just made up the most repulsive lie imaginable as a way of seeking attention, and who could blame them? The whole thing just sounded too far-fetched, too horrifying to be true. But as it turns out, they were all dead wrong. My name is Michael, and this story is definitely not for the faint of heart. It involves 3 different crimes, one of which is murder, big surprise, but the other 2, I'm going to let you fill in those blanks on your own. And one of the victims did talk to reporters very freely 25 years ago, but I'm going to give her an alias. I believe she's still alive, and Sarah Morgan is not her real name. The full newspaper article from my thumbnail is available at grimsilence.com, and if you're interested in true crime that's older and more obscure, please be sure to like and subscribe. And I say this wholeheartedly, if you're not completely ready for this, please click away right now. This story is completely fucked. In 1995, Disney ruled the box office with Toy Story and Pocahontas. The internet was just beginning to creep into American homes, and O.J. Simpson's murder trial dominated the headlines. And in Boynton Beach, newspapers would soon be reporting 2 more crimes that were, in many ways, much worse than anything O.J. was being accused of. It was Saturday, April 15th, 1995, and 39-year-old Sarah Morgan was having yet another heated argument with Richard Caille, her boyfriend of 5 years. On several occasions, their alcohol-fueled arguments had reached the point where one of them would pick up the phone and call the police. This time, it was Richard who was dialing the authorities, but what he told them was definitely not your typical domestic disturbance complaint. Even as an adult, Sarah Morgan was still telling her unbelievable tale, but this time she had been telling it to Caille over and over during the course of their relationship. It was usually when she was drinking, sometimes not, but Caille was very familiar with all of the sordid details. Few had ever believed what Morgan said had happened at her house, and even worse, none of the adults in her life had ever done anything about it. Richard Caille, however, was about to change all of that. He did believe what he had been hearing from Sarah Morgan for the previous 5 years, and he had decided that it was high time they tell the police. It was time, in his words, to make things right. A Boynton Beach police car arrived at the pair's home and whisked Morgan and Caille off to the police station. And what Sarah Morgan told detectives would spark a media frenzy and criminal investigations in 2 different states. Prior to her parents' divorce in 1971, Sarah Morgan, then Sarah Corvin, lived with her 2 sisters in what appeared to be a typical family home. Their mother, Rosina, was working 2 jobs to help put their father through school. Their father, Mendham Paul Corvin, never did graduate college, but in his line of work, he didn't really need to. In 1995, newspaper reports described the 63-year-old Paul Corvin as a retired electrician, but he was something of a jack of all trades who had also worked in a lumberyard and as a bricklayer. Paul Corvin liked working with his hands. But what he liked even more was drinking. And although one former neighbor conceded that he was sometimes a happy drunk, Corvin was just as likely to be an extremely mean and violent drunk. According to Sarah Morgan's youngest sister, Judy Corvin, and their mother, Rosina, Paul Corvin was in the habit of beating his 3 daughters when he was drunk. And starting in 1967, when Morgan was 11 years old, Corvin began to R-word his own daughter on a regular basis. He would walk into the bedroom that the 3 girls shared and knock on one of the bed frames. That was the signal that one of the 3 girls needed to get up and give him what he wanted. Sarah always volunteered herself. She was the oldest, and she did what she felt was necessary in order to protect her little sisters. Sarah's sacrifice, although very noble, was in vain. In 1995, both of Sarah's younger sisters told Boynton Beach police that their father had R-worded them as well. For a period of about 5 years, Sarah Morgan submitted to her father's demands. It wasn't long until young Sarah was pregnant with her father's baby. One would think that a girl who was 11 years old, going on 12, and pregnant, would raise eyebrows. At the very least, Sarah's mother should have realized that her daughter was about to have a baby. But no, Rosina Corvin claimed that she didn't remember her preteen daughter being pregnant. She did, however, recall the night in 1968 when Sarah locked herself in the bathroom. She refused to come out until her father got home. It's unclear exactly how it all went down, but at some point, Sarah's mother did walk into the bathroom. Sarah refused to get off the toilet. Her mother, who seemed fully intent on burying her head in the sand, eventually left and went to her job at a local hospital. That night, 12-year-old Sarah squatted over the toilet and gave birth to her first baby. It was a baby boy. Paul Corvin, who had come home by the time the baby was born, immediately took action. According to Sarah Morgan, her father took the baby boy out of the toilet and put him in the bathtub, not to wash him, but to drown him. For whatever reason, this attempt to murder a newborn baby failed, so Corvin took the baby outside. What took place next is a bit uncertain, but according to the headlines, Paul Corvin buried the baby boy while the infant was still alive. He later told police, quote, "I knew before the baby was born that I had to get rid of it." What happened in the Corvin house after that was not publicly reported. In the months leading up to the child's birth, it should have been very obvious to Sarah's mother and her two sisters that Sarah was pregnant. Considering their mother's very obvious strategy of denial, it's probably safe to say that the family simply didn't talk about it. A few years passed, and Paul and Rosina Corvin got divorced in 1971. The divorce was an ugly affair, with each side firing accusations at the other. Paul Corvin accused his wife of having an affair, and it was noted in court documents that her alleged lover was a black man. In 1971, that was apparently still considered scandalous if you were a white woman. Rosina Corvin, in turn, accused her husband of touching the girls, to put it politely, but the mother also said in a deposition during the divorce that the girls had never complained about their father's behavior. She said that the girls simply did not want to speak out against their father. Paul Corvin fought for custody of his daughters for reasons that are now abundantly clear. And in a stunning failure of the justice system, the court actually granted him full custody of the girls. In 1995, a Palm Beach Post columnist wondered aloud whether an interracial affair was a more serious crime than R-wording one's own daughters. When the divorce was final, Rosina Corvin got the car and the house. Paul Corvin then promptly moved his girls to Scottdale, Pennsylvania, just down the road from his hometown of Connellsville. For the Corvin girls, life in Scottdale continued much as it had in Boynton Beach. Paul Corvin's drunken rages continued, once causing two of his daughters to run to the safety of a neighbor's house. The police were called, and Corvin responded by threatening to fight his neighbor for giving shelter to his girls. At some point, the Corvin girls also went to the police in Scottdale. They were clearly afraid of their father and were looking for somebody to help them. According to Judy Corvin, quote, "They told us to just disappear on weekends. They told us to go back Monday, when he was sober." Marlene Wedge, the daughter of the man Corvin had threatened, remembers when the Corvin moved into their neighborhood. It was 6 months before she saw the girls for the first time. And upon hearing the news in 1995, she finally understood why. When the Corvins arrived in Scottdale, Sarah was pregnant yet again. This time, Sarah Morgan gave birth to a baby girl. She testified in court that she wasn't sure whether the girl was alive after her father had pulled the baby out feet first. Paul Corvin told police, quote, "I carried it downstairs and laid it on the floor. It quit breathing and turned blue. I didn't know if it was alive or dead. It was then that he buried the baby underneath the old home's coal bin, a relic from the days when coal was used to heat homes. The coal bin would eventually be covered with concrete by a later owner of the house." The violence and assaults in the Corvin Scottdale home eventually became too much for the girls to bear. Carol, the middle child, ran away from home, and she later resurfaced in Florida. Meanwhile, Sarah and her sister Judy went back to Boynton Beach for a vacation at their mother's home where the girls once lived. When the vacation was over, Sarah made the very intelligent decision to stay with her mother. She was finally free of the monster that was her father. Judy Corvin returned to her father in Scottdale, but just a day later, social services showed up and sent her back to Florida. Sarah had called them from Florida to report the beatings. And when Judy arrived back in Boynton Beach, Sarah told her sister about what their father had been doing to her for the previous 5 years. Newspaper reports didn't say that Judy already knew, but it seems unlikely that Judy found this news to be surprising. Rosina Corvin was still living in the girls' childhood home in 1995. And then, on the Saturday that Richard Caille spilled the beans to the police, Sarah Morgan showed up at her mother's house with her boyfriend and a small army of police officers who were armed with shovels. Sarah Morgan and Richard Caille waited at a neighbor's home while Boynton Beach police started digging. They dug up the backyard of Morgan's childhood home for 4 hours. And then they found what they were looking for. The tiny bones of a nameless boy were buried next to the air conditioning unit on the side of the house. After a phone call to the Scottdale Police Department, which had not handled a murder case in 7 years, Paul Corvin was quickly arrested. Corvin confessed to burying the baby boy in Florida, and he did so without a hint of emotion or remorse. He also owned up to burying the baby girl in Scottdale. Police suspected that he may have admitted to the second burial in order to avoid facing a death sentence in Florida. Erwin Osip owned the house once occupied by Corvin and his daughters. When Scottdale police knocked on his door, the man jokingly quipped, "What did I do now?" Osip was horrified at hearing what had taken place in his home. He immediately gave the police permission to dig up his basement where the coal bin was located, and officers came in with a jackhammer and other tools to break up the concrete. Word of Corvin's sickening crimes spread quickly around Scottdale, which had a population of about 5,000 at the time. As in many small towns, the people of Scottdale prided themselves on being a friendly community, a place where children and families are safe. And when the Corvin news broke, both Scottdale, Pennsylvania, and Boynton Beach, Florida, were blown away. Neighbors in Scottdale already knew that Corvin was a heavy drinker and that his daughters lived in terror, but they had no clue what Corvin was really doing to his girls. Locals gathered on the street and watched as police officers brought out wheelbarrows loaded with rock and dirt. Outside the house, police had set up a tent where the debris was sifted through for any signs of human remains. Police were unable to locate anything of substance until Corvin drew a map to where he had buried the newborn. 33 hours after digging commenced, they finally located the baby girl's bones. Erwin Osip said that he was going to get some holy water from his church. He wanted to sprinkle it where the baby's remains had been found, because the girl had not been baptized. Throughout the police investigation, Paul Corvin was calm, cold, and he showed absolutely zero remorse. Corvin told police that he didn't care who knew about his mistreatment of his daughters. He thought he would never be caught. According to Boynton Beach detective James Mahoney, quote, "He said it was alive, but he didn't care. He just wanted to kill it." Of course, he was referring to the first baby, the one that Sarah had birthed right into the toilet. Even despite the horrors that she suffered at the hands of her father, Sarah Morgan still cared about the man. Nonetheless, She testified against her father in a deposition for 2 full hours as she recounted everything that her father had subjected her to. Corvin's attorney had no choice but to try to win his client's case on a technicality. While he attempted the usual legal maneuvering, Sarah Morgan's mother and sisters expressed their anger at Richard Caille, Sarah's boyfriend. They accused him of telling authorities out of spite. The family, it seems, was perfectly content living with their horrifying secrets. Morgan herself has said that she never would have spoken of the crime had Richard Caille not forced the issue by calling the police. Morgan's youngest sister, Judy Corvin, made her feelings on the matter clear by saying, quote, "It's over and done with. It was best forgotten." Were it not for Caille's phone call to police in 1995, it is all but certain that the whole family would never have spoken of it again. Paul Corvin initially pleaded not guilty, but he changed his mind just before jury selection was to begin. Corvin instead accepted a plea deal that was arranged by state attorneys in both Florida and Pennsylvania. He claimed that he wanted to spare his daughter the trauma of a trial, apparently ignoring the lifetime of trauma that he had already subjected her to when she was a child. It should be noted that Corvin didn't take the plea deal until after a very important decision had been made. In June of 1996, a judge ruled that the jury in Pennsylvania would be hearing about the baby Corvin buried in Florida. Corvin's attorney had tried to stop this devastating evidence from being admitted, but he failed, and his client's fate was sealed. Corvin knew that he was about to be convicted of murder, and suddenly he felt the need to protect the daughter he had used in such ugly fashion. Under the terms of the deal, Corvin would plead no contest in Pennsylvania, which is essentially accepting a conviction without admitting that you committed the crime. In Florida, Corvin would plead guilty to murdering the baby boy. Paul Corvin was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison, but in the end, he would only serve about 4 years behind bars. Corvin had a long history of heart problems, and he died of a heart attack in 2000. Upon hearing the news of his passing, one of Corvin's 3 ex-wives reacted by saying, "Thank God he is dead." By now, Sarah and her sisters are probably in their mid to late 60s, and I hope they're doing well. And this was a wild one. If you have some thoughts to share, and I'm sure you do, please comment below, and thank you for watching.